Story 1, this account I'm using is a throwaway, designed to keep something hidden from my partner. My life played out in a quaint little house nestled in a New Zealand small town, a considerable distance from the bustling hub of Auckland. This tale dates back around 6.5 years, so certain details might have been tweaked due to the passage of time. The incident I'm about to recount is one that continues to send shivers down my spine even now. Everything transpired when the sun was just beginning to warm the morning air. I had a grocery list in mind and intended to make a quick trip to the local market that consistently buzzed with activity from 8:30 in the morning onward. It was one of those regular days, but fate had other plans. As I swung open my front door, the sight that greeted me was far from ordinary. Resting right at the center of my doorstep was a flash drive, so petite that I nearly overlooked it. The initial reaction was a blend of confusion and caution. I scanned my surroundings half, expecting some teenage pranksters to jump out from hiding. Yet, the outside world was eerily silent, amplifying the flood of questions swarming through my mind. The most immediate thought was, who could have placed this here? The USB drive lacked any distinguishing features, just a plain and unmarked device. It seemed unlikely that someone would go out of their way to trek to my home and leave it there. And yet, that's exactly what had transpired. The origins remained a mystery. It was impossible to ascertain who had deposited it and whether they did so with the intention of piquing the curiosity of someone gullible enough to plug it in. Naturally, I did what any curious individual would do. I carried the flash drive indoors, reasoning it might be prudent to connect it to my computer. The contents were exclusively pictures, a myriad of them filling every nook and cranny of the storage space. I embarked on a visual journey by opening the first image and sequentially progressing through them. Initial shots captured mundane scenes from around town, places I frequented during my leisurely strolls. The turning point arrived with the fourth picture, snapped on the busiest street in our town. Amidst the throng of people was a figure that immediately seized my attention. The photograph portrayed me amidst the crowd, going about my business as I had on a recent grocery shopping expedition. A tinge of skepticism crept in as I considered the unlikelihood of such a coincidence occurring in a small town. The following image, taken on the same day, sustained the intrigue. Once again, I found myself in the photograph, but this time, the photographer had been in close proximity, almost uncomfortably so. It was apparent that these pictures had been taken without my knowledge or consent. The series continued, depicting me in various locations across town. Yet, a chill crept in when the images transitioned to a more unsettling theme. The very house I lived in, illuminated by the darkness of night, its living room bathed in the glow of a single light. As I clicked through, the images grew progressively more invasive. Through the living room window, I spotted myself seated on the couch, engrossed in my phone. The clothes I wore indicated that the snapshot had been captured the previous night, moments after my shower. The realization hit hard. Someone had been observing me from the shadows. The ensuing photos unveiled an eerie pattern. Shot after shot of me inside my own home, each taken from just outside a window. The stark contrast between the brightness within and the darkness outside shielded my voyeur from view. They didn't need a flash. The internal lighting illuminated their vantage point. The unsettling narrative continued with over 20 photos chronicling my every move inside the house. Then an unexpected twist emerged, a photograph originating from within my hallway. It became evident that the person behind the camera had invaded my home the previous night. My living room, my kitchen, my dining area, all documented, presumably after I'd retired for the night. The series escalated as the unidentified presence ascended my staircase, drawing ever closer to my slumbering form. A storm of thoughts ravaged my mind. Had I unwittingly antagonized someone? Could this be a sinister vendetta, or perhaps the work of an eccentric individual fixated on me? The most chilling thought loomed large. Was this an armed invader? Regardless of motive, the unnerving truth remained. Someone had trespassed my home, photographing every nook, including my bedroom. The climax emerged in the second-to-last picture, an image of me, sound asleep, blissfully unaware of the unwelcome guest within my sanctuary. And then the story concluded with a handwritten note, presented in stark close-up. Never hide a spare key under your doormat. The realization struck hard, like a thunderbolt. I felt exposed and vulnerable, and my safety was invaded. In the aftermath of this harrowing revelation, I made the decision to relocate, seeking solace in a new environment, far from the echoes of this sinister chapter.
This incident unfolded in the backdrop of my childhood neighborhood, right as I had crossed the threshold into adulthood at 18. My bike became my steadfast companion, propelling me through the streets for hours on end while my ears were serenaded by the strains of music. It was a cherished retreat from the demands of reality, a divergence from the more common indulgences of reading or video gaming. The neighborhood, a circular enclave resembling a cul-de-sac, possessed a unique layout with 2 entry points and homes lining both the inner and outer edges of the loop. My biking ritual, save for the colder winter months, had been in place since my early teenage years. Back then, my excursions were punctuated by fleeting encounters, the occasional speedster or exuberant pooch dashing astray. However, shifty individuals were the farthest from my concerns. One typical day, I was cruising around the familiar circuit, the rhythm of my journey unchanged. My attention was snagged by a neighbor in the midst of renovating her driveway. Unperturbed by the sight, I continued my laps, tracing the loop a few times. Yet, it was a seemingly innocuous act that triggered an unusual turn of events. One of the laborers working on the driveway signaled for me to halt. My upbringing had ingrained in me an excess of politeness, rendering me oblivious to any potential hazards. In a rather unsophisticated manner, I entered into conversation with the 2 men, all while maintaining a calculated distance and keeping my foot near the pedal, ready for swift escape. The exchange meandered through light-hearted queries, and my responses, earnestly polite yet curt, sought to draw a clear boundary. As the interaction wrapped up, I skillfully extricated myself and pedaled home, the comfort of my residence in plain sight. Guns were a fixture in my household, knowledge of which was not lost on me. This awareness lent me a sense of security, knowing that I could wield them in case of an emergency. Hence, the thought of them being aware wasn't a concern. Days elapsed, and I once again embarked on my customary bike ride around the block. Rounding a corner, a disconcerting sight greeted me. One of the men from before had parked a distinctive gold car in my driveway. Its dual rear-view mirrors resembled those of some police vehicles, a detail that clenched my gut in anxiety. Passing my house, I managed to disguise my apprehension, proceeding to circle the backside of the neighborhood. There, he had shifted his position, now stationed in front of the house he had been working on. He brought his vehicle to a halt, partially obstructing the road, and disembarked. Both his driver and back driver side doors were flung open as he intercepted my path, marking my second encounter with naivete. Remaining cautious, I maintained a comfortable distance. The stranger extended an invitation suggesting we grab lunch together. I promptly declined, citing my father's imminent presence at home. His skepticism was justified, as my father's truck was indeed absent. He wasn't home at that moment. Quick thinking led me to concoct a tale. My dad had parked his truck in the garage, busied with work there. With that, I promptly pedaled away, my escape hastened by a surge of adrenaline. The gold car and its ominous dual rear-view mirrors vanished from sight, yet the imprint of the experience persisted. The mere sight of a similar car could reignite that pit in my stomach, a residual effect of the encounter. That night, I mustered the courage to recount the events to my parents, seeking solace in their guidance. Their response, albeit with a tinge of jest, left me feeling unnerved. They suggested I should have indeed gone to lunch with him, irrespective of his intentions. The unintended implications stung, exacerbating my feelings of vulnerability and insecurity. I've recounted this tale numerous times, and even though it remains one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever endured, I've come to realize that its intensity makes for quite a gripping story. So, I've decided to share it with all of you here. Let me start by acknowledging that camping was never my cup of tea. As a kid, I attended summer camp in Colorado each year, a venture that included obligatory woodland camping excursions. These brief sojourns into the wild were always a source of annoyance. Lugging heavy bags, the absence of proper bathrooms, and the unwelcome intrusion of spiders in my tent. However, the plot took a twist when I turned 16 and assumed the role of a camp counselor in training. During that phase, my sentiments toward camping saw a fleeting transformation. We were just a few years older than the eldest campers, but we enjoyed a good deal of freedom in our actions. While most evenings we were required to stay in the cabins with our charges, there was a rumor that the camping trip served as a time when counselor in training folk would indulge in drinking, smoking weed, and maybe even some romantic escapades once everyone else had dozed off. What I couldn't have foreseen, though, was how this particular camping venture would shape my view of wilderness camping forever. The escapade kicked off as any other, with about 30 people comprising our group, 4 counselor, in training 4 fully fledged counselors, and roughly 20 kids aged 13-14. As we trekked in single file, the din of conversations and laughter amongst the campers often drowned out the sounds of nature. Hours passed as we meandered through a marshy landscape and up a steep incline covered with evergreens and aspen trees. Now, I wasn't the most athletic of youngsters, so by this point I found myself bringing up the rear with another counselor in training named Jordan, alongside 2 campers who struggled to keep pace. Chatting away, we unwittingly lagged farther and farther behind the main group until they disappeared from view around a bend, some 50 feet up ahead. We proceeded at our own unhurried pace, not overly worried, but after around 30 minutes, the trail leveled off and a gnawing unease settled in. Not only were the other campers nowhere to be seen, but we had entered a stretch of eerie, dead evergreens. Half appeared charred from a fire, while the remainder seemed afflicted by some sort of disease. The eerie landscape was punctuated by a decrepit cabin nestled amidst the scorched forest, miraculously unscathed by the inferno that must have consumed the surroundings. Our captivation with this sight was rudely shattered when one of the campers screamed at the sound of a snapping twig behind us. Jordan and I chuckled at first, but that mirth swiftly transformed into alarm when we turned to locate the source of the sound. There, a mere 20 feet behind us, stood a disheveled figure, a man with tangled black hair and a sprawling beard. His eyes were fixed unwaveringly on us, his appearance bereft of any hiking gear. We couldn't fathom how long he'd been tailing us as we descended from our reverie. Youthful trepidation washed over us, but Jordan managed a tentative wave. Seizing upon our nervousness, the man's voice cut through the silence, posing a question barely audible. "Going camping?" Jordan responded in the affirmative. And the man offered a small, sinister smile while intoning, "Better be careful." We nodded and mustered a muted thank you before briskly resuming our path, our pace now decidedly more brisk. Strangely, the man remained stationary on the trail, watching us as we ascended, eventually vanishing from his sight as the trail wound away. Reuniting with the rest of the group, we shared our encounter with the adult counselors. They casually dismissed it, suggesting the man likely lived in that cabin and was merely curious about our presence. Nevertheless, a sense of disquiet lingered, a hunch that the man might followed us. As we arrived at the campsite, I wrestled with lingering anxiety, the specter of the man's presence gnawing at me. Yet, over time, I pushed these concerns aside and managed to find a measure of enjoyment in the proceedings. As night fell, the other campers retired, leaving Jordan and me to explore the illicit joys of a couple of pilfered Warm Mike's hard lemonades and a joint I had squirreled away for just this occasion. To sidestep any trouble, we ventured into the woods to smoke the joint, settling at a river's edge where we had previously done our dishes. The environment was oddly hushed, and the man from earlier kept insinuating himself into my thoughts. Assuming my shivers were due to the cold, Jordan gallantly offered his blue hoodie, sparking a suggestion from another girl that we swap tents for the night, ensuring I could bunk with Jordan. I had no objections, and after our tokes we returned to our tents, slightly removed from the others. There we huddled, sipping Mike's hard lemonades and exchanging spooky campfire tales. Time slipped by, and one of the boys was spinning a poorly concocted story when a hush descended. Footsteps like twigs crunching underfoot echoed about 40 feet away, close to a fellow camper's tent. We strained to catch the sounds, but they suddenly ceased. It was likely just a camper seeking the restroom, yet under the intoxicating spell of our high and the chilling tales, we chose to call it a night and retreat to our tents. Jordan followed suit, and in the aftermath of some awkward fumbling, finally succumbing to slumber. I can't pinpoint the exact time, but it must have been the dead of night when I jolted awake to the unmistakable sounds of footsteps skirting around my tent. Pulsing with adrenaline, I lay still, attempting to regulate my breathing. The steps were undeniable, mere feet from the front of my tent, pacing back and forth. I contemplated waking Jordan, but my relief was palpable when I observed his absence next to me. Assuming he was the source of the sounds, I closed my eyes and was on the precipice of sleep when the zipper of my tent began to move. In a swift flurry of movement, Jordan joined me in the tent. As my eyes grew heavy, I suddenly recognized my urge to relieve myself. Murmuring about needing to pee, I began to unzip my sleeping bag. Jordan's irritable response was muffled, his hoodie pulled over his head in an attempt to shield himself from the light. It was at this moment that I felt reassured, believing that it was indeed Jordan who had just returned to the tent. With shoes on, I tiptoed across the campsite towards the designated pee zone. However, barely had I begun when I heard rustling, emanating from the campsite, like someone rummaging through our belongings. A bit disoriented from the alcohol, I hurriedly adjusted my clothing, stumbling and grabbing a branch for balance, an action that resulted in a loud snap. Struggling to regain composure, I peered up and discerned a figure perhaps 40 feet away, moving across the campsite. Before I could react, the spotlight of a flashlight blinded me, its intensity growing as the figure approached. Panic-induced paralysis took over as the light expanded. Someone was advancing toward me. Immobile and terrified, the figure came within 10 feet of me, and then I heard Jordan's voice, a calming presence. His word, "Sorry, it's just me," flowed over me like a warm embrace. At that moment, relief washed over me, and I caught a glimpse of Jordan's silhouette as he approached. I breathed a sigh of relief, but Jordan inquired about his missing blue hoodie, wondering if I'd come across it. He'd been scouring the area, suspecting a camper had filched it from his bag while he slept. Confusion gripped me, and I stuttered, "You were just wearing it when you returned to the tent." His response shattered my sense of security. "What are you talking about?" he queried. "It's been missing since we got back from the river. I even checked down there, but when I couldn't find it, I thought to inspect the boys' bags. And that's when I spotted you." My bewilderment transformed into terror when it dawned on me that the individual who had entered the tent with me earlier wasn't Jordan. Sensing my distress, Jordan probed further. I stammered that whoever took his hoodie was in our tent. He was skeptical, but insisted on investigating. With extreme caution, we approached the side of the tent, and when Jordan flicked on his flashlight, a piercing scream echoed through the night. A shadowy figure, unmistakably a man, lay motionless inside our tent. The sequence of events that followed remains a blur. We dashed to the neighboring tents, where the older counselors were bunking, our frantic yells rousing them from their sleep. A sense of panic rippled through the group as they gradually awoke, and after a chaotic exchange, the gravity of the situation sunk in. The counselors grabbed their walkie-talkies, urgently calling the camp to summon the police. The fear in their voices mirrored our own. Sleep was elusive that night. With dawn's first light, a few counselors arrived armed with guns, escorting us back to camp. On the return journey, one of the campers stumbled upon Jordan's hoodie, tied to a tree like a sinister marker. He refused to reclaim it, and we left it behind. To this day, I can't say definitively whether the man in the tent was the same individual we had encountered earlier on the trail. However, his visage and that fateful night continued to haunt me,